Dr. Emmanuel, we can start.
All right. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon from wherever you are joining us. Thank you very much for making the time, and a special thanks as well for the fact that a lot of people today were on time. We actually had to keep some people waiting in the waiting room. So thank you very much. My name is Matambo Emmanuel. I work here at the Center for Africa-China Studies, and we are co-hosting this event with the University of Johannesburg's library. So thank you to Palisa and the team at the library for for helping us to put together what I hope will be a very stimulating discussion. By way of context, as you might know, the United States of America has a president who is not so much new. He had another term between 2017 and 2021. Donald Trump. And as expected, the United States seems, at least to the rest of the world, to have taken a stance of economic nationalism. And that has necessitated a raft of tariffs on both friend and foe. If there is any redeeming feature, I guess, about the United States, is that it doesn't discriminate these days. Anyone is fair game when it comes to American imposed tariffs. So we are here though to discuss specifically the tariffs that the United States initiated against the People's Republic of China, and obviously China retaliated as well with tariffs. The percentages are unprecedented in global politics, and the consequences could be consequential for the rest of the globe, because here we are dealing with the two foremost economies, the first and the second largest economies in the world. And because of that, we are discussing what the likely impact of that trade war between China and the United States is likely to be. There is an African proverb that says, when two elephants are fighting, it is the grass that suffers. But when Julius Nyerere once said that at a Commonwealth meeting, Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, said, but Nyerere, even when two elephants are making love, the grass still suffers. So I guess we should have that in mind as we are having this discussion here. And to drive the event, we have put together two very informed scholars to help us with this. The first one, who is no stranger at all to the Center for Africa-China Studies and the University of Johannesburg in general, is Sanusha Naidu, who is a political analyst and a foreign policy analyst as well, based in Cape Town. She is an associate of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue at the University of South Africa. Her work mostly centers on African democratization, political economy, and South Africa's foreign policy. She holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Staffordshire, and she has previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution, and she has also managed the South African Foreign Policy Initiative at the Open Society Foundation. From 2008 to 2010, she analyzed Africa's relations with China and other emerging powers. To that effect, by the way, she has written and edited 2 volumes on Africa's relationship with China. For those of us like me who have in this space as well, we have used both of those books. You can also see Sanusha's analysis on ENCA, SABC, CGTN, Al Jazeera, at BBC, and the New York Times as well. So that is a very drastically reduced biography of Sanusha. She's also a very reliable friend of the center. This is not the first time we are hosting her, so we can rightfully claim her as a friend of the center. Sanusha, this is over to you. Thank you very much once again for making time.
Again, thank you to the center, thank you to Emmanuel, thank you to the director of the center, for always giving me the opportunity to be part of these very dynamic, informative, and relevant and timely discussions. I'm not sure how much of time I have, Emmanuel. If you could just give me an an
Ye-
outline.
No problem, Sanusha. Between 15 and 20 minutes, it should be fine.
Okay, so I'll try not to take too much of that time so that we can open it up for more interaction and discussion. But as Emmanuel has sketched out in the introductory remarks, I think the discussion comes at a very important time, if not a very critical time, with regard to where's the trajectory of the international system. But more importantly, I think in terms of what we all have now come to accept, and that is the international system in a state of fragmentation, in a state of uncertainty, in a state of fluidity, but also I think in a context that we cannot necessarily have any predictability in. So I think that in itself is not necessarily something that we can assume that it's business as usual in terms of where the structural, economic, and political conditions are within the architecture and the ecosystem of the global system right now, but rather that we're not sure how it's evolving and we're not sure where it's going to, and we're not really are able to predict, or even with our finger on the pulse, to be able to say with any kind of degree of perhaps relative certainty that this is what the outcome will look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So as we've been discussing this both with colleagues in the center and in other important policy dialogue spaces, one of the things that I think for me in this architecture and ecosystem of where we are currently in the global international order, or in terms of where the international order is really around this idea is how do we interpret it, how do we define it, and what is the kind of conditions in terms of where we are going. Some people call it a dystopian international system right now, that it's really much about how you survive. Some may argue that's a very classical realist approach because there's a lot of uncertainty, and for scholars of international relations, we kind of reflect on the billiard ball scenario, or the billiard ball characterization of realism, the classical realism school of thought, where states are clashing in the international system very much like a billiard ball, or if you play pool or you play whatever kind of, if you play pool or you play snooker, etc. These different colored balls are essentially clashing in the international system. The system is very anarchical, and the system is essentially about survival of the fittest, so it's dystopian in that way. I think for others it's really about what is the causal issues. What we're seeing right now is the symptoms and the consequences of a kind of Gramscian understanding of this international system, which, if for those of us who follow the works of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher, who spoke about in his prison diaries, the dilemma of the international system, where the old is dying, the new is yet to be born, and in this kind of integrum of the system, you have these morbidity of consequences. So that's another way to interpret it. That how did we arrive here? Why are we in this context? And I know I'm trying to give you a much broader understanding of where we are in this trade war right now, and why this trade war is becoming almost an existential crisis, if not the kind of deepening of the symptomatic issues within the international system around the geopolitics and the geoeconomics, and of course just invariably the ecosystem of the international order that's in a state of complete, whether you want to call it a breakdown, a crisis, or is it falling apart? Can we really pull it together? Some of my friends and I were chatting recently. I was in Ghana. I just came back, looking at some of the questions around environmental governance. And the discussion revolved around this question of who's going to put the system back together again. And I think though that's some of the structural questions we are asking ourselves in this context of the trade war, and what does this global architecture mean going forward? Can it be a system that can be reformed? Does it need to be transformed? What are we talking about in terms of multilateralism? So I think all of these kind of push and pull factors are coming into this play, in this theater of play at the global level, where the idea of what does the China-US trade war mean for Africa? What does it signify? Where does Africa find itself? And Emmanuel referenced, the African saying about when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled on. But he also, referenced it the other way around, in terms of being intimate. But I think the challenge here is really where we find ourselves right now in the context of Africa. Is it something that's of our own making? Is it something that we've been part of the symptomatic issues? What are the root causes? So I think to try and set the scene and perhaps to be a little bit engaging around some of these challenges, the question is it Donald Trump and the trade war per se and the tariffs that has now created a deepening crisis? Or has this been in the making for the longest time? And how has Africa been responding to the shifts and the changes in the global architecture, particularly around the trade, the global economic architecture, but also in recent times? And I think if we go back and we look at this global order that we're talking about, this global order has actually been characterized by a set of institutional governance frameworks. And these institutional governance frameworks have been set in terms of who underwrites these governance frameworks, but how these governance frameworks define the global rules of trade, but also the global rules of commercial engagement, and of course, interaction at the level of the world economy. And we can't deny that these institutions, in the way that they've been formulated, in the way that the rules have been set, have actually been disproportionate. They haven't necessarily been about equity, inclusivity, fair and just trade. It's been set in a manner that's created to be a little bit more fair and equitable for one set of actors, and not so fair and equitable for another set of actors. And so we have to bear these issues in mind when we talk about where we find ourselves now in terms of the international political economy, and where we find ourselves in terms of the global trading architecture, the global trading regime, and what these rules have created, and why now we're beginning to see, or rather we've been experiencing, not just now, but I think for the last decade, if not more, from about, I would say, the last 30 years and so forth, the impact of what these trading rules have done in the context of what we're now seeing as the symptoms, and where you have this trade war being kind of institutionalized in the context of tariffs and the kind of tariff barriers, but also the imposition of how tariffs are being interpreted as a means of protectionism. So it's not new, is what I want to say, Emmanuel. It's not something that just kind of sprung up like a borehole of water somewhere, or a spring. It's been there, and it's been manifesting itself for the longest time. And so if we go back to the rules-based system, we go back to the trading agreements, we go back to the WTO in particular, and we go back to the various successive rounds of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade and Tariff, we go back to 1945, we can see that manifestation happening. And that those were rules set, that those rules had very clear implications for Africa, and it had very clear implications for the global South. And in particular, it was about how you managed these trade relationships, how you managed the issue of the adoption of tariffs, how you managed the successive rounds of the Uruguay, the Tokyo, as well as now we haven't had any consensus on the Doha development round. So the architecture of the model of the trade relationship that has been put forth in the institutionalization of the governance of the way we trade is very much part of these issues. How these issues have actually led to who controls some of these market dynamics, who actually sets the rules, and who actually implements it. And so you have that now being almost becoming obsolete in the international system, where the kind of impact that you're seeing where with regard to the protectionism of markets, etc., is now what we see, in my opinion, as the symptoms, the morbidity of the consequences. To take some of the Gramscian model is where we are. The U.S. has used the trade to protect the market, and so the politicization of the trading global architecture is something that has been happening. And so the question is, we shouldn't be surprised by it right now, but we need to be much more cognizant of the impact. And these impacts are really around the fact that the model is built on this neoliberal architecture. And this neoliberal architecture is very clear. It says you have to basically have things like comparative advantage, which is an Adam Smith, Ricardo Dunn kind of approach. And the rules based on that is basically how the bigger major economic powers have used that in terms of how they had their own kind of investments going out. They did offshoring of production. They basically moved, when labor became very expensive, they moved their production sites to countries that were much more labor competitive in terms of pricing, which then has an impact on the cost of the production of the good. And so all of this is now coming back to the structural changes that are happening within these countries, within these developed economies that are also going through their own kind of existential challenges around an economy that's becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. There's a rise of populism. There's a rise of different dynamics of labor. People are saying, well, where's the production? You move the production out to China. And China very strategically was brought into joined the WTO and became part of that global economy. So the political economy question is much more important, I think, in terms of impact and how does this go forward. Just as a matter of time, I'll fast forward to what does this mean? So what does this mean now is that the very architecture and the systemic nature of the international system and the economic ecosystem is now being put in a state of conflict, because the rise of populist movements is also about a system that essentially that hasn't really created also equality, inclusivity, but also hasn't created jobs and employment in these economies that you now see that were underpinning the international financial architecture and the trading regime. There's a pushback against stagnant wages. There's a pushback against the fact that the free market system has enabled competition, the rise of competing financial centers, but also competing production sites. There's a kind of pushback against immigration coming into that market and cheap labor. So there's a whole lot of different push and pull factors that have now led to how this question around a trade war is being articulated about what? It's about the politics of rage and so forth in these communities, where it's easy to raise this in a populist way and says, well, you don't have a job because the previous administration or whatever have moved jobs to Asia, or whether you call it offshoring. And so this becomes part of the dynamic. And so this is where we find ourselves in the context of the impact of this trade war. And this trade war is very much about an existential crisis of a model, but it's also a crisis of the fact that within these economies, that within, for example, the dynamics of the US and of course as well in the context of China, it's the way in which the architecture of the international system has been politicized under trade. So you have, in the case of Africa, this competition between US and China over who gets greater traction in the, not just in the African market, but I think also in the African political design and the political engagement and the reaction to China in Africa. And so this trade dynamic is not just about a trade war and the impact, but it's also about trying to use that kind of dynamic to create political cooperation engagement, and more now under things like the critical minerals. And you're seeing that play out in the African continent from a geopolitical, geostrategic dimension, where certain countries are pushing with their engagement with the US and the impact that this may have in the context of the relationship with China. But what it does do is that it does tell us to a large extent that the trade issue and the entire geopolitical economic architecture has become politicized. So we've basically, as one report said recently, I think it was World Politics Review, called it the weaponization of trade. And that's what a trade war is. It's a weaponization of how you use your agency, but you use the leverage of that agency to try and push what you want out of recipient countries. And so the question in this context for Africa is, what is going to be the impact? I think you've got to break it down into short, medium, and long-term impacts. But before we do that, we've got to also understand what is Africa's economic architecture, what is Africa's internal trading regime, and can Africa absorb the shocks from the system? And at the very, very basic level, the challenge is that Africa's trading regime, its ecosystem in terms of its inter-African trade is very small. It's very minuscule. It's very negligible. To give you an example of the fact that Africa is not trading enough with each other, how does it create those markets of integration? How does it create the integration into the global economy? And what is it exporting to the global economy? We keep hearing about the primary commodities. And we keep hearing about the fact that Africa needs to move towards the kind of value-added addition, including, South Africa and other countries who may be a little bit more industrialized than others. But the challenge is that you're not doing enough trade in order to create that kind of market traction to be able to export what your products are in terms of value addition and how that may be affected. So at that level, there's that question. But taking that question further and taking this statement further also tells us that if you are adding more value addition to your production, that is when the tariff becomes even more invasive. It becomes more kind of impactful on you. So if you're just sending a product out of the continent, which is primary, has no value addition, the question we should be asking is, we need to unpack and disaggregate, is how much of impact will that have on the African economy? So we keep hearing the issue of the African Growth Opportunity Act. We keep thinking about the critical minerals, etc. How does that impact in terms of this trade war between the US and China? Does it impact on Africa in terms of the value addition? And the second point to that is, how does the politicization of this whole tariff war and the trade war between the US and China impact on who we do trade with? So there's that level in which I think we've got to unpack the structural issues and the structural conditions and what the implications are. For example, I would say that we must be careful in assuming that there is going to be a renewal of AGOA. I think that we're seeing AGOA going through its various iterations, but whether or not it stays, we don't know. And I think some commentators have argued that we now are talking about a post-AGOA US-Africa relationship. Don't think of AGOA as an underlying dynamic to that. But I think for us in having this discussion, both for South Africa and Africa, there may be different implications. So there may be implications in terms of in the case of countries which have certain value products, and I'm not talking about value products in terms of where you are in the manufacturing scale of production or in the supply chain and so forth in production, but I'm talking about the extractives, the critical minerals, you may see different dynamics emerge between the US and China and the African country. And I think we're seeing some of this play out from a geopolitical perspective, where the US may be using this trade, these tariffs as a way to negotiate bilaterals. And I think that is what we need to think about again in the impact and how this may then navigate and how it may actually be interpreted in Beijing and what will be that kind of relationship at the bilateral between African countries and of course the US on the one hand and China on the other, and those implications that will impact there. The other disruption, I think, from this trade dynamic is, if you're looking specifically at South Africa, is again other dynamics that may be important, but that is in the case of South Africa. I think if we're talking purely economics, we're hearing a lot about what certain bilateral economic relationships may actually be affected by this. So in the case of South Africa, we have to think about the impact on other industries. And using the fact that the trade dynamic is not just about the trade, it's also about South Africa's broader foreign policy behavior and broader foreign policy engagements. So there may be those dynamics, and some may argue that South Africa is not the most favorable country right now in the US. We've got this whole this bilateral review legislation that has been put forward by the U.S. Parliament. I think it's the House of Representatives, to review the relationship, because South Africa seems to be a bit of a disruptor. It's not kind of fitting into the narrative of what's coming out of the US about South Africa. And of course, we had the whole question about the issue of very bad things that are being done in South Africa, as quote unquote by President Trump, in the context of South Africa. And so these are the tensions as well that will impact. So it may have that dynamic that may not be directly linked only to the trade war and the tariff issues, but also the fact that South Africa has been in the crosshairs and has not necessarily been seen favorably in Washington, not just by the Trump administration, but even by the Biden administration. And that's not necessarily one that is a partisan issue right now. It seems to be across the board. And that this can also impact on how our relationship with China is interpreted, as well as the fact that our relationship with other countries like Iran and Russia is also interpreted. But then bearing in mind that South Africa is also very the foreign policy space is a very transactional space. It will be interesting to see how this is then discussed. And of course, let's not forget the whole ambassador issue and the diplomatic fallout around the former ambassador to Washington, Ambassador Rasool. So these are the dynamics that are playing out. And of course, we can't ignore South Africa's case under the ICJ and so forth with regard to Israel and the issue of the genocide and the Palestinian question. But in saying all of that, I think there's also this dynamic around what these executive orders mean for South Africa. So the latest one being the issue around the film industry, and where filming outside of the US is going to have 100% tariff. Now, that ties into not a general kind of trade dynamic, but it's definitely a revenue stream for us in terms of how we look at South Africa's structural conditions, South Africa's kind of destination for filming the movies and other kind of Hollywood productions outside of the US. And that also impacts on our not just on our relationship with the US, but it also has impacts for our film industry, for employment spaces and other kind of implications from a economic, social, as well as a developmental, a tourism perspective. And these are things that we can't necessarily see how it goes through, because these things can actually be announced in the US, but then it can have different impacts, because down the line, we're not sure what the Trump administration may seem to be doing. But at the same time, I think for South Africa and Africa more broadly, I think we should not get caught into this dynamic that China is going to be a replacement to the US. We do, in the case of South Africa, do have to deal, and with Africa, we do have to deal with the fact that whilst there's a trade war taking place or a tariff war taking place between the Beijing and Washington, it doesn't mean that for Africa and South Africa that Beijing is going to come in and be that kind of panacea for us. If you take, for example, the similar challenges that we need to think about in the case of China is tariffs as well. Because again, it's the question of what we export and how much of value addition that export we have to China creates a import tax or a tariff tax in China. And so one of the areas that, for example, South Africa has to deal with and Africa has to deal with is the trade deficit between Africa and China. And more importantly, this has been a key issue that President Ramaphosa at last year's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation emphasized very, very importantly. He said, we have to deal with this. And this was a recognition. But at the same time, there are other tariffs that place higher taxes on African products that have a value addition. And one of the areas that South Africa struggles with in the context of China is the steel industry, because China has subsidized its steel industry. So to be able to compete in that space, it makes it difficult again. So I think what I'm trying to say is the implications are not only about, looking at it in the context of what will happen to Africa, but I think the question is how are these issues being discussed at the policy level in Africa? How is it being addressed in terms of the kind of regional economic issues at and of course more continental frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and then of course you're having this kind of bilateralism, which is again a kind of reconfiguration of relationships and so forth. I'm not sure how much more time I have, Emmanuel, maybe about 5 minutes or 2 minutes.
5, Sanusha.
5. So
Yes,
let
please.
me start to draw my inputs to some kind of concluding remarks. I think for us it's much more dire in terms of what this trade war means, not necessarily as just an overall impact on Africa, but we've got to look at it from a sectorial positioning. What does it mean in the way that it impacts particular sectors? And having said that, I think we've also got to be careful and cautious in assuming that it's not going to have a kind of disparate impact on African countries who may be now thinking of how they want to negotiate between China and the US and what the transactional nature of that means. And so we may have to start asking ourselves those hard and awkward questions about where does the opportunities lie in terms of the challenges? And some countries may feel that if you're small, you have to make certain decisions for your own national economic interests. And that means that it may not conform to what the idea is that this impact from the trade war is negative for Africa. There may be opportunities for smaller countries who realize that it's easier for me to work out a bilateral in negotiations with the US, and it's based on this idea that the US will leverage that. And we're seeing some of that starting to emerge in terms of whether or not this creates the kind of a kind of geostrategic maneuvering and a continental maneuvering between countries in saying, well, I can negotiate bilaterally with the US on this, and this, but then does this impact on my relationship with China? Or if I'm negotiating with China, does this impact on my relationship with the US? And I think you're saying, Emmanuel, about who gets caught in the crossfire and what happens at the grassroots when two elephants are in a state of conflict with each other. I think it's not always the idea that it's going to be always about negative impacts. It may just be that African countries start strategically realigning themselves, because right now, as I go back to reflect on my opening remarks, we're in a very dystopian global system. And so these rules, etc., are now very much being interpreted in terms of the politicization. But I think for me, the real issue is, where does African agency lie in this context? yes, as you're trying to move up the value chain and industrialize, the question would be is, are we taking into account what this means for value added production in terms of tariffs? And the third point is in terms of this trade war. And the third point I want to make is this question of whether or not Africa becomes caught in the crossfire because it may be engaging with China in terms of the trade, but then there's this question about having a kind of, not necessarily under the tariffs, but having some kind of sanction imposed on African countries because you're doing business with China and vice versa. So there may be this issue of third-party impact. So if indeed we are selling goods to China or we have an economic relationship with China and we're trading with China, there could be some kind of impact on our relationship with the US and vice versa. And then the final point in this is what will happen to African goods that go to other countries, and then that relationship in terms of the trade war between the US, China, and say Asia, the US and China, Latin America, US, China, Europe. So I think we are really now in that corridor of uncertainty, Emmanuel, and the biggest challenge for me is what's happening in the African context in terms of production, industrialization, and how is it trying to use its resources, not to just keep it at a primary level of commodity exports, but rather the value addition and how are we interpreting that. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Sanusha. That was quite a tour de force there, and I think the colleagues now understand why we keep calling her to come and present here. As you catch your breath, Sanusha, if you do not mind, and before I introduce Prof. Munyai, because I have received lots of questions. So if you don't mind, I would just like to read some of those. You can just respond to some of those. Some of them are comments and some of them are questions that you need not respond to substantially, such as one that is asking whether or not they can find what you have just presented now in an opinion piece that you have written, whether or not you have written an opinion piece or you have done interviews and stuff like that. That is one of the questions there. Another question here is from Moshe Makoka, and it goes as follows. Do you want me to ask you a question and then you respond, Sanusha, or I put them in a pack and then what process do you prefer?
I think just let's group them and then
Okay.
I can respond. It
All
makes
right.
better time management.
Yes, indeed. So a question from, welcome by the way to Prof. Munyai. I will come to you after we exhaust the questions that have been accumulated for Sanusha. The first question comes from Dr. Moshe Makoka. It says countries and companies are renegotiating tariffs with the Trump administration. Can this practice be encouraged to African countries to follow in order to balance relations with the United States of America? If I did not read it well, it's also in the chat there. And then a direct question sent to me about you regards one of the penultimate points you made there about this war being broader than just about trade and about South Africa's foreign policy behaviors, as you called them, because a lot of people, I think, because of how spirited the Trump administration has been, people sometimes tend to forget that discomfort with South Africa is actually a bipartisan policy in the United States, stemming from South Africa's stance on Israel. So the question then goes to say, what did you make of the appointment of an emissary, Mr. Jonas, to the United States of America? So what is your understanding of that, and how is the United States likely to respond to that? And then another question, the third question, which will be the final one for this segment. The questioner quotes what you described as the existential crisis of a model, the current model, the existential crisis of the current model. And your reference as well to Gramsci about the old is dead, but the new is not yet born. Are we living in a new world order, or are we living in an order that will only last for the 4 years that Trump will be president of the United States? So if you could respond to those, Sanusha, thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And I really appreciate these very important and insightful and thought-provoking comments, questions, and remarks. On the first one, I'm not, I mean, I do have stuff. I think, but I can't point to one particular opinion piece or whatever. I think the best thing would be to have a look at the Institute for Global Dialogue website. And normally what we do there is we do a roundup of our interviews, short comments, opinion pieces, and it's not just me. I think colleagues will also be able to pick up on my other my co-colleagues in other in the IGD that are also writing on this, and so they'll have a bigger, broader, and a much more expansive spectrum of views, which will help to get an insight into this topic. But I want to say maybe just say this about this topic. It's a moving target, Emmanuel, and so trying to write one single piece or trying to keep a single narrative is very difficult because it's constantly changing and it's constantly moving. So I think that is why it's always important to look at everyone's engagement on this, including the Center, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and there's so many different institutions, even in the US, that are engaged in this, and even in the continent, that will give a lot of colleagues a holistic understanding, because the narratives are kind of shifting and shaping and pushing and pulling with each other, and just the interpretation will be important. So that's my first question there. Regarding the broader trade dynamics and the South African foreign policy behavior, and you're right. I mean, everybody assumes that, we've got to understand that this is a bipartisan issue. It's not just about, one single party. It's not about the Republican Party. It's not about the Democratic Party. It's about the US Congress and how both houses are viewing this even before the Trump administration came in for the second time. I think if you go back to the Trump administration 1.0, which is in 2016, there were little murmurings. I mean, the issue about the land question and the dispossession of certain minorities of their land, it was kind of floated, but it didn't find the traction as much, is my understanding. I could be wrong, but it didn't get the kind of media attention that it did. But this time around, I think it's important to bear in mind that the Biden administration kind of set some of these things into motion as well. And remember, under the previous ambassador, Brickety, I mean, there were these challenges, there were questions about South Africa, and in particular about the ANC's relationship with countries that were considered to be not countries that were in the interest of the US. And then suddenly it became the question of the US national security questions. And you had the whole Lady R saga and so forth. And even when you speak to certain policy think tanks in the US and certain commentators in the US, from not necessarily from mainstream think tanks. I mean, those that have been major supporters of the South African anti-apartheid struggle, they also feel that South Africa post-apartheid, it kind of didn't keep the traction, didn't keep that engagement alive. And so they also feel that there's a bit of that kind of a waning of the engagement between Washington and Pretoria. So I would say that, the appointment of former Finance Minister Mcebisi Jonas, I mean, it's an interesting way in which you are kind of looking at the system in the US, you're looking at the structural conditions in the US, and you're making a decision where an emissary doesn't have they can do everything that an ambassador can do, but not necessarily be appointed as an ambassador. And I think in the context of diplomacy, you have to think about what strategic diplomacy is and what strategic diplomacy means. And what I feel is the thinking and the logic, and again, completely not in the room, so I don't know if that's what the thinking and logic is. But what I feel is that it's to look at what's happening internally and domestically in the US. I mean, today I think the US the US Fed is going to make a decision on the interest rate. That is going to have an incredible impact on global markets. already global markets are and stocks and shares and all of that are going into all kinds of speculation about what's going to happen. But if you listen to the governor of the US Fed, the head of the US Fed, which is equivalent of our Reserve Bank governor position, he made a very interesting statement. I think it was this morning or yesterday. He actually said what the tariffs are going to do to the US economy is that it's going to heighten inflation, it's going to push unemployment up, it's going to create much more economic disparities. So there's a warning in the US by senior people within the US commercial space, within the finance space, etc., that these tariffs are going to be detrimental to the US economy. And I think what we as South Africa, as other African countries are looking at is to track that. And what will be that impact in next year's midterm votes? In other words, when they vote for the House of Representatives and the congressional senators, etc. And will that then have an impact on the Trump presidency? And to be able to take that and understand what that means in terms of the shifting political architecture domestically, even in the US. And so this is where I think you don't have to be reactive, but appointing an emissary like Mr. Jonas gives you that little bit of time, that little bit of breathing space to be able to do the kind of smart diplomacy, strategic diplomacy assessment, and to understand that, and to then, to be able to understand what's going on there, and then to use that as a basis to say to the South African government, you know what? This is how we're seeing it. These are the discussions we had. These are the pulse points where we feel we can get into and we can start engaging. And I suspect that people in many ways have actually now become conditioned by the fact that if one side appoints an ambassador, you must naturally appoint an ambassador. There's nowhere in my understanding of diplomacy and in terms of this entire world of international relations and foreign policy engagement that you have to always be reactive. And I think we make the mistake of assuming that that's where we need to go. Is Mr. Jonas the kind of person? Well, let's see what happens. Let's see how he goes forward with his position. And more importantly, I think what is also a bit disturbing is we kind of now got caught into this thinking that as soon as somebody is appointed from the African side, and I'm not talking South Africa, I'm just talking Africa in general, we got to look for those things where they said bad things about Trump. And we got to put it out there in the media. And we got to keep saying, will Washington accept this? We need to flip the narrative. We need to flip the script. People that have said bad things about Africa and then get appointed to Africa from other countries. This is not diplomacy. And then that for me was quite disturbing because Mr. Jonas has a very good, important track record around anti-corruption, around where he found himself, and so forth. And I found that to be almost like we must now go and try and play this game, and that's not diplomacy. It applies across the board, not just to whether people said bad things about Trump in the past, but it applies to everything. Even if somebody comes from China that gets appointed here, we must vet them as well, and we mustn't just look at it in terms of this idea that the center of the world. And I think I'm segueing into this existential crisis, and the model, and again, that's the problem. People have now made this world about the US is the world and the world is the US. I think we've got to move away from that because the framing of the international order is based on this idea that the world is defined by a post-1945 period. If you go back and look at long cycle theory, or you look at the evolution of different orders in a historical context, you had this from around about different countries underpinning the international system, the hegemonic system. And I think where we are right now is that that system is in a state of crisis. It's in a state of existential change. And so it's not about whether Trump stays 4 years in the Oval Office. It's not that. It's not about whether we're in a new world order. We are in a dystopian world order right now because we can't see what the future holds. And so it becomes about this kind of where everything is almost this kind of polycrisis of note. And so whether or not this international system sustains itself in its current format, design, and execution, I think is the flaw. It's the structural flaw that we can't rely on a system that's in a state of a design challenge. Its reset button is not there because we don't know what's going to happen in the US. We don't know what's going to happen in Europe. So we've got to see this international system as in a state of flux.
Wow, thank you very much, Sanusha. I just have two comments to make. The first one is just to remind the colleagues once again about what Sanusha said. You can find some of her work on the website of the Institute for Global Dialogue. And then I know a lot of people are enthusiasts on YouTube, so you can also see some of the interviews she has done with prestigious news outlets. The second comment I'd like to make is just what your very insightful answer, Sanusha, about the appointment of Mr. Jonas as an emissary. There are people who have said worse about Donald Trump and today are serving in his administration. People might actually not know that J.D. Vance was one of the people to popularize the term Never Trumper in 2016. And he is also one of the first people from the Republican Party to liken Donald Trump to Hitler. Today he is serving as Donald Trump's vice president. So yeah, I think we shouldn't be one-sided as Sanusha says, and we shouldn't dredge up the negative things someone said about someone when you are pointing them to that particular person's purview. So thank you once again, Sanusha. I see that in the chat we have more questions, but I will ask you to respond to those questions after we hear some remarks from Prof. Munyai, who has joined us. Prof. Munyai is the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies. He has worked for the Development Bank of South Africa, and he has also worked for the National Assembly of South Africa. He is an analyst on international affairs, and he has, you can, like Sanusha, you can also find him everywhere on YouTube. He has been a consultant for a lot of media firms in South Africa. And he has been the founding director, actually, of the Center for Africa-China Studies, where he also dabbles as the co-director of the University of Johannesburg's Confucius Institute. Prof. Munyai, I know you are tired, you have been traveling, but please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sanusha, thank you. I'm in Thailand, Bangkok, and I just, attending a seminar on middle powers. So the issues that we're seized with, I mean, you see quite a number of countries all over the world. Your Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, India, and others are battling with more or less similar. So I think my starting point will be some of the issues, major issues have already been mentioned by Sanusha. Just to echo some of the issues and just add just few issues. I think our starting point in my own view is that the early phase of responding to President Donald Trump was quite disappointing at government level, where it was haphazard, constant response to every tweet, and the center was not holding. There was that sense. But I think with time, you see a gradual shift at the president's level, where it appears to me that the center is holding. Some of the noise is being ignored, rightly so, and real clear messaging. The manner in which the government responded to the appointment of Mr. Jonas was quite professional, level-headed, clear, real diplomacy that we talk about. It shows that South Africa could stand above the noise and really start thinking, what is it that South Africa is seeking from United States? Well, what is it that a person like me is expecting from government, and what I'm not seeing? Are core issues. One is to understand that this crisis, it's not, as Sanusha has mentioned, and some of the question are pointing to the very same issue. This crisis is a start of a much more prolonged crisis. I think that's the starting point. So anyone who's dreaming for a 4-year end of the crisis, I mean, it's just a dream. This is a start. These are early phase of a much more bigger crisis that is coming. So at the government level, I think one would expect planning at 3 levels. The long-term plan, how do we handle a unraveling of the global order? I think a real rich thinking document should be coming out. Where do we stand in that global change? With or without China, with or without the US, or Russia, this unraveling, because I think the lessons we learned from the previous Cold War is that it was mainly fought on our continent. Now, the bigger question in that planning is to just understand that any bigger fight, it will be on the continent in any form, because the continent remains in the bigger scheme of things, the weakest link in terms of development, in terms of defense. Our deep seas are not defended. It's just an open, free ride for everyone from any part of the world. Even some small insignificant powers, they tend to come to Africa and behave big in a big way. How then do we think as South Africa, as the region and the continent, have a common position around ring-fencing the continent in all these facets of an ever-evolving global order, which will with a clear understanding that what is happening in the truest sense, it's unsitting of a hegemon. That's what is happening if we are to call spade a spade. It's United States and the Western world are losing the power that they have had. And I do not think there's anyone who will ever agree or accept giving up power. So in all form, in economy, in security, moral standing on issues of human rights, as the case of Gaza and the like, the US and large part of the Western world. And we need to also to be very careful, because what we understand is the West is also changing. It's also changing in a bigger way. And one could even argue that with the expansion of BRICS, in no time, we're going to have members of BRICS coming from the so-called global north, very soon, actually. In the next 5-10 years, we're going to have countries like Spain and others, I mean, will be attempted to join BRICS. And the issue is not, is to understand, and they are also understanding that where they were standing, the ground is no longer as strong as it used to be. I think there's also need at second level thinking at the government and how the government should respond, and the continent. The medium-term planning, how do we, what are our next steps in dealing with this within multilateralism? What order, where do we stand, and how do we strengthen? And I think the bigger question of asking there is, should this tariffs wars continue, and crises all over the world, conflict, what kind of a world without United States leadership? Well, the simple question I asked is, what is G20 without United States? Or what is BRICS without China? I think we should be able to ask those kind of questions for us to understand the power dynamics within these multilateral structures. That and therefore and think the last level of thinking is the immediate. The immediate, I think that's where the government, in my view, is doing extremely well. I think there's been this pragmatic move to engage with all the shortcomings of that ability to engage. But the fact remains that it doesn't matter what South Africa can do or not do, given the power matrix. South Africa does not carry that weight to be able to really change United States' position on key issues. I think our view, where I share Sanusha's views, is for us to understand the domestic dynamics within the US and rally forces to our advantage, and continue that even if we have problem with the White House, the Black Caucus and other sectors, religious and other communities within the US, we can tap on them given the dynamics of power in the US itself. But the weakness is that at policy level, I think if we do more at a region level, at the SADC level, to start understanding what is it that the United States wants from Africa. At the moment, I think the key thing that President Trump, the US and the rest of the Western world want from Africa are the critical minerals. It's first and foremost, is the new center for the new Cold War. How are we responding? We have to go to Congo, the Great Lake region, and how are we responding? We seem to be haphazard. You have Zambia, you have Angola. We talk about the Lobito corridor. Our failure to coordinate better, to have common position, is our weakest link. It's not a question of just us doing the beneficiations, bringing all this machinery and technical skills, but it's a question, to what extent can we bring your Chinas, your United States, your India and other powers to work with us to ensure that we have a clear set of norms and values to govern these critical minerals, so that we lessen conflicts, because future conflicts will be around this mineral that we know, and it's also happening. That's why we lost troops in the DRC. We have all the crises that we face. It's around that. I think more will happen in other parts involving other critical minerals, including ourselves. We also have a lot of critical minerals. So I think that thinking is required. So in a nutshell, my view will be, to what extent do we plan ahead in the shortest pragmatic way of engaging, with an understanding that in the medium and long term, we need clarity where we stand. And the last parting shot from me will be, if we look crises of this nature in the past, history tells us 1929, 1933, it ended up with the Second World War. So history has a tendency of repeating itself. The start of this crisis, will it lead to a war? Yeah, it's yes, a clear yes. It starts with trade wars, it starts with all this. In the end, it's going to come to the South China Sea, the disruption of trading routes. And are we asking ourselves, who are we trading more with? Should there be disruption in the South China Sea, where bulk of our trade is South Africa and the continent? And it's not only with China, but Asia. Asia is the most important continent for us. So if there's any war, whether it's India, Pakistan, or any South China Sea, do we have plans? What is it we're going to do? I tend not to see that kind of planning of alternative markets, going all over the world, building your SAA, making the OR Tambo being the biggest hub, saving other markets that we're not. That we just stuck to your liberal thinking that you need volumes of people on the move to build infrastructure, which is limited and short thinking. Anyway, let me pause here. I think in the absence of the second speaker, I thought I should just chip in to give Sanusha a breather with wonderful presentation she's giving. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Prof. I have questions here, so I will read them, and then, if possible, Prof. Munya, you can you can divide the questions between you and Sanusha. The first question, though, there's one question that is specifically for you, Sanusha, but this first one is a general question, and it comes from Dr. Sizo Nkala. It is actually a two-part question. The first question is divided into two parts, though. Will we see China dumping its products in African markets as a result of its trade war with the US? And then how should Africa deal with this? So those are two parts of the same question. And then the second question, still by the same scholar, Dr. Nkala. Secondly, what will be the impact of the US-China trade war on Chinese demand for African commodities? That question is also in the chat, Sanusha, in case I did not articulate it very well. And then the second participant asked the following question. Given South Africa's long-standing position to the question of land distribution and Palestine, is there any hope to mend SA-US relations or look at alternative trade partners? And then the last question is specifically for you, Sanusha, and it comes from our good friend Lirato Tsebe. Just a question for Sanusha. The African Continental Free Trade Area recently witnessed its first hiccup with a small tiff between Malawi and Tanzania in light of the trade saber rattling between the two majors. How can African countries and the AfCFTA take advantage of this pending battle? So that is for you, Sanusha. There is a question as well specifically for Prof. Munyai, and it deals with one of the last things that you said, Prof, when you said Asia is the most important partner. I think that those were the exact words. The question I was trying to copy you verbatim. In what sense is Asia Africa's most important partner? Are you suggesting that we prioritize trade over politics as Asia is replete with dictatorial leaderships? So those are the questions. Maybe we start with you, Sanusha, and then give Prof. Munyai some space to breathe. Yes.
Yeah, he's got the tougher questions, so I'll give him some breathing space. Emmanuel, I think what we also did is I didn't answer earlier question, which was from Prof. Makoka, or yeah, it was about renegotiating tariffs with the Trump administration, and then can this practice be encouraged to African countries to follow in order to balance trade relations with the US? The long and short of my response to that is, how do you negotiate with the Trump presidency or administration? We've seen in the last 100 days or more of the Trump administration taking office that it's been a very disparate way of dealing with this administration. You're not sure of what is a line or what is a space of negotiations. We've seen people like the Ukrainian president initially being kind of given a talking down to in the Oval Office. We've seen the spat between the Canadians and the Trump administration. We've seen the issue around Greenland, and the question, you know, must be looked at in the context of, is there a reasonable space that you can utilize to negotiate some of these tariffs that have been imposed or signed as executive orders with the Trump presidency? In other words, is there a way that you can actually sit down across the table and say, let's negotiate? And I think that's the difficult part, because you're not clear, because there's no kind of cohesiveness to how these things are being done in Washington. And so I think this comes out as well in what we're seeing as issues that are emerging with regard to, Greenland should be thankful that we want to come in and, claim you territorially. Let's make Canada the 51st state of the US. But what's interesting is the pushback by the current Canadian Prime Minister, and how that has played out as well. And what's also very, very disturbing is that it circles back to a point, and it's the last point that David made around what is your coherent strategy? What is your process of engagement in the short term? Do you have a position? Do you have a regional strategy, or even what you call this, a strategy that doesn't have to even be regional, just a strategy? And I think that's the challenge as well from the African side, is what is the agency of cohesiveness and speaking with, you don't have to speak with one voice, but you can speak with a relative voice that actually talks about key issues that underpin the development agenda for the continent or for the region. And I think the fact that everything is so scattered and fragmented in the way that positions are being discussed, the way strategies are being defined, and the way in which interactions are being conducted, that it also makes it very difficult on this end of the world, particularly in the context of Africa as well, is who's given the mandate to negotiate? Who has negotiating a strategy? Who has a negotiating consensus? So the challenge is you're dealing with 55 countries under the AU, or 54. I forget again who's been in, who's been kicked out, and so forth. But this makes it very difficult to create that space, because everybody now is thinking of their national interest. Everybody's kind of using that as the basis, and everyone is trying to also utilize what they could best extract out of this. And so that, for me, I think is a challenge. So I think both sides have serious structural dilemmas around what you're gonna negotiate, because you're not sure what you're negotiating on the tariff issues with the US, with the Trump presidency. On this end, on the African side, you got to have that common position. You got to have at least three areas or three issues that are systematic and systemic and critical to the continent that you negotiate on. But if you don't have that, doesn't make much sense in terms of where you're going. So I think that is my long and short answer of it. And maybe people will agree or disagree with me, but I think that's the real challenge from internally in the continent and regional blocks as well, is that negotiating capacity and that ability to coordinate and have consensus on what you want to negotiate on is not there. So you even have disparities between the five regional blocks, the economic communities, and so forth. Well, on the basis of the dumping, as a result of the trade war, how Africa should deal with this, and secondly, what impact will this have on African commodities? I think you can see the impact that's having on African commodities, but the question is, what commodities? Are we talking the critical minerals, just the extractives, the resources? Because that is already, we're seeing that happen in terms of not having that coherence around what does the DRC do. So this bilateral is also from the African side, is that, oh, let me negotiate as well, because I can then leverage my resources, my national interest. And I think that's already happening. And whether or not this is going to happen only with the US in terms of what was cited as the DRC, and we're seeing what's happening there, or is it also with China? So I think we have to prepare ourselves, David, for that. In terms of the strategy, the short-term strategies, we got to start preparing for that level of disaggregation in the continent, that level of not, we talk Agenda 2063, but how are we actually using that to create that aspiration for Agenda 2063? And we don't have that coherence and that agency of one voice. So I think that's already, we're already feeling the effects of that happening on the dumping of products. Again, I would caution and say, if you're going to use, if we're going to talk about China dumping its products in Africa, we must be specific about what products, which sector, where it's happening, and in which countries. Because I get the sense that sometimes the narrative becomes too broad on these issues. So if there's dumping, if we're talking about dumping, we also have to define what we mean by dumping. Is it physical products that are being dumped in the African market? Is it products that are so cheap that they actually disrupt the African market? Is it because of subsidization of the steel industry and it makes Chinese goods much more competitive and therefore we cannot compete? That is also a part of a definition of dumping. So I think this trade war is not the reason why these products, or however we define dumping, is happening. Dumping has been happening. That's the bottom line. But we've got to basically ask ourselves is, again, how are frameworks in the African continent being utilized to track this dumping? I said I was in Ghana for the last 2 days on environmental governance questions in West Africa. And one of the things that came out was fascinating about the maritime security and the issue of protection of the maritime ecosystem, but also the question of overfishing. And one of the things that came out was how and it wasn't just about Chinese ships, it was generally fishing trawlers, the big fishing trawlers of some countries, that essentially when they're coming into your seas to do fishing, apart from the fact that they overfish and they destroy the ecosystem of livelihoods of people, and they destroy the fishing ecosystem, they also retain water in the bottom of the vessel, all the waste. And then when they get into the west coast of the African west coast of ECOWAS, they start releasing that waste. Is that not dumping of waste? So we've got to be careful. And in the broad context, in how we place this, we got to be specific. So in terms of the environmental governance question is, how do we deal with that waste that is being basically dumped in African waters, destroying African maritime ecosystems, destroying livelihoods, because now other fish are dead or whatever? That is an issue. So again, is it as a result of the trade war, or is it a bigger question of how dumping has become a problem, not just because of the trade war? And I'll leave it at that. On the question of South Africa's long-standing position to the land issue and redistribution issue in Palestine, is there a way to hope to mend South African relations or look for alternate partners? I mean, the world is, I couldn't say it any better than what David said. We must look at a world beyond the US. We must look at a world beyond hegemons. We must look at a world that everyone has to now think about it's not about who's going to underwrite the rules for me. It's how I'm going to underwrite the rules for the region, for the continent, for whatever. And I think the challenge we have here is we still are conditioned. And I said this before, we conditioned to see the world in a particular way. It's the way that the world has been formulated from the time in which the international system has been dominated by particular countries based, and I'm not just talking 1945. I'm talking, for me, it goes back to the point in which the modern state came into being, the Treaty of Westphalia. And that then created a narrative. It created a rules-based system. So it was easy to transfer power in terms of how that happened with regard to empires. And David mentioned the First World War, and he mentioned the Second World War. But remember, as we moved in those different periods from British imperialism to US hegemony, it was easy transition. Because they kind of were in their space. They were kind of engaging. They were fighting for territory. They were involved in land grabs. They were involved in questions of land issues. The territories. It was there. And so for me, the challenge is, there's no such thing as alternate trade partners. Everybody's a trade partner, irrespective. Everybody you trade with. I remember what some of the respondents I interviewed a while back on South African corporate expansion, and somebody said to one of the executives, I can't remember from where, said to me, "Remember, Ms. Naidu, the business of business is business." And so it's about that. It's about the fact that you can't replace one with the other, because again, we built the model of comparative advantage into the system, but we don't do comparative advantage under the neoliberal or the liberal order or the economic order. We do absolute advantage. We want to produce everything, and we want to sell it, and we want to make sure we don't just have a value chain, we capture the entire value chain. And this is part of the problem, that when it becomes cheap, offshoring becomes problematic to domestic constituencies. One of the things you learn in business, in how business is conducted as well, and one of the things you learn in international relations is distributional coalitions. And distributional coalitions is domestic constituencies in your domestic economic environment who will place pressure on the government because they're losing out. And they do place pressure on the US. And so this is part of the challenge of what is happening. So I'm not saying that we need to mend the relationship. The question is, we need to find out how we actually become pragmatic about the engagement. And there's no such thing as alternate trade partners. Everybody is a trade partner. It's just how you manage the relationship and what you actually define as the trade partnership. To Larato's question, I'm not sure if she's asking me how countries can take advantage of the ACFTA and have more conflict, or is she asking me how the ACFTA can actually become an institutional framework to actually resolve conflict of this nature? But I would say this framework to resolve the conflict, or to basically take advantage of the conflict, because I think the ACFTA is essentially quite an interesting framework. Well, you have a dispute resolution mechanism as one of the protocols in the framework. The question is, how do you operationalize that dispute resolution mechanism, and whether that dispute resolution mechanism is to resolve conflicts between companies only, state to state, state investor, very much like the bigger ones that we have in the global economy. And that is where you need to start thinking about this ACFTA's dispute resolution mechanism. And this dispute resolution mechanism is also quite critical, because one of the challenges you have in Africa is regional overlapping of membership. So you have Tanzania, part of EAC, you have Malawi, part of SADC, also part of another regional bloc, and this becomes very complicated. So if you're going to have a regional, a continental framework of a dispute resolution mechanism, and the question is, how do we address this in terms of this pending battle, then you have to actually ask countries and regional blocs to start institutionalizing this dispute resolution mechanism. Right now, we need to start thinking about the ACFTA as domestication of national institutional frameworks of the ACFTA. And if you start institutionalizing that, you have to institutionalize the 3 or 4 protocols under the ACFTA. That is trade in goods, that's its trims and trips, which is all part of one framework. Then, of course, you've got the DSU, which is the Dispute Settlement Unit, which is the dispute resolution mechanism. Then, of course, you've got rules of origin. Then you've got trade, women and youth and protocol. So if you have to start domesticating the ACFTA, then Malawi and Tanzania and that conflict has to also conform to what is the domestication and the regionalization of this framework. Because then you can start thinking about inter-Africa trade. But once you have this overlapping membership, it complicates the process. And this is where I think the challenge lies. And there's one question there which I'm going to take a chance and go and answer it, which is about the trade war mean for AGOA. What if ACFTA, the ACFTA doing to remedy or avoid this trade challenge in Africa? The ACFTA has been adopted. It hasn't really started to trade in the manner that it should be trading. There's a bit of a light trade happening in services. But the problem with this is that we assuming that where the ACFTA is and where AGOA is equal. Secondly, we're making the assumption that AGOA is going to remain. I think we must try and get this out of our heads that AGOA is staying. I'm not sure if it's staying. I'm not sure if it's going to be ratified. I'm not sure it's going to be renewed. So I think we've got to be careful in keep peddling the AGOA narrative when we know that the AGOA narrative may actually be kind of having its post-mortem right now. So be careful of that. The ACFTA still needs to put into place and domesticate, and I think I've answered part of that question, is that we're not trading with each other in the way that we are. Yes, we may have instituted duty-free access or zero tariffing access for goods and services, but remember, there's still other challenges. There's still other bottlenecks and institutional challenges around freedom of movement of people. Goods don't just move. People move, so do services. And so goods will move with them. We still have to deal with visa regimes. We still have to deal with how people are moving between several African countries. We still have to deal with competing and overlapping regional membership. So I would think that that question is actually like trying to take our crystal ball out and trying to foresee whether the ACFTA will be able to address some of these bottlenecks in terms of AGOA. And that means that there has to be more internal intra-Africa trade in order to have that kind of duty-free, market-free, and rules of and tariff-free engagement of service of goods and how you're transacting. But the other problem we're having is also this issue about what is trade in services. So to get to where we want, I think we'll probably have to be like Star Trek, to envisage the future and see where we go, where no other people can go. But we have to go there in the context of Africa if the ACFTA is to have full implementation and become a critical, active framework for intra-Africa trade.
Thank
Are
you
you
very much,
unmuted?
Panosha. We'll just go directly to Prof. Munyai. Prof. Munyai, your question was about your statement about Asia being our most important partner. Were you talking about that, advising Africa to prioritize trade rather than politics and foreign policy because Asia is replete with dictatorial leaderships? Yes.
Okay. Thanks. I think to pick up, I'm coming to that question, but to pick up from some Sanusha's statement, is my starting point is that we perhaps have to start learning to unlearn your world that we were in of unipolar, bipolar kind of world to a multipolarity. I think that's what is emerging. We are in the early phase of multipolarity. And I think we need to understand what does it mean to be in a multipolar world order. It will increasingly become issue-based, understanding certain sets of issue and language towards who buys into that club. Lots of club membership and membership fees that we have to switch in and on and off an ongoing bus touring the world, depending on the issue. But we have to be smart about it. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. We need to really fully understand the major lesson I learned from the Canadian leader speaking to President Trump. I think there's just one killer sentence he made, which I thought, if all other leaders are listening, when he was responding to President Trump about the real estate, and he said that there are things that are not for sale, and he addressed it quite well. So starting with this room, and therefore Canada is not for sale. In a way, I think bringing it home, I think there is a need to also start stating quite clear what is it that is not for sale. Even though there hasn't been any claim of any piece of land on the continent, but in terms of our foreign policy principles, what is it is not for sale? What is it is we cannot compromise on? I think we just don't say that. I think we tend to respond and over-explaining ourselves at all times. But there is a need to really set and say these are no-go areas. We are not going to negotiate these issues, and these are our core issues. Now, moving straight to the dumping question, I think I'll just simply say it's not a question of China dumping on the continent. Whether it has been happening or it continued to happen is neither here nor there. I think the bigger question for me is to what extent is South Africa and the continent improving its own products as we find new alternative. Also competition, because we are friends, we are all in this club, BRICS, but at the end of the day, we also compete among ourselves as BRIC countries. So I think there's a much more effort and question we should pose in terms of to what our own state of preparedness in terms of improving our systems, infrastructure, the cars that we're buying from China, what is it that we're demanding? I think it's a simple issue. We couldn't just accept vehicles coming in from China. We need to say the tires, the iron and the steel, the wool, this leather, quite a number of products that goes into a car. Those need to be secured and need to be sourced within our own domestic markets. I think we have some of those products. We should be able to argue that because China is our strategic partner in that sense. So I think if we sharpen our arguments around those issues, it will give us an advantage and ensure that the imbalance trade, it's somehow handled. Why is Asia important? I think that's the core question. And the question of dictators. I know we all schooled in these human rights issues, but let's face it, and not being brutal, we really can talk human rights and about the whole day. But at the end of the day, we need food on the table. I think it's just as basic as that. That when we talk about human rights, it's not just about voting and movement of people. It's also a question of addressing the questions of the belly. People must eat. People must have electricity. People must have roads. And I think, I belong to a school that says both the ballot box and the belly are the same. They are equal. We need to feed the ballot box with papers every 5 years. And make a lot of noise and singing and dancing, but we have to go home on a road that is paved. We need electricity. We need to deal with core issues, having food at home. So we need to address all those things concurrently. So when you look at Asia, from this year marks the 7th year of the Bandung Conference. It's a critical year. I think we need to go back, look at the Bandung communique, and work with Asia and others to address some of these issues, because we have similar core concerns and grievances. And then how can we work? Asia is the biggest market. When you talk about money in the world, unfortunately, my brother Lumke, I think I saw his name popping up. He would have been an ideal as an economist to tell. Money is in Asia. Those days of thinking money is in Washington and London, those places are dry. If you really want money, you have to go to Asia. Far beyond China. China is the core, but when you talk of the whole of Asia, is quite critical. If you look at real technology, where real business is happening, where countries are really succeeding, it's Asia. So Asia seems to be the core of this century, and we are there. Our time is coming. I think we are the next big thing, but we need to work with Asia. I think it is in that context that we need to find more and more of our products into the Asian market. We need to do business with Asia. Already we're doing more business with Asia. So the question of the importance of Asia, it's in no question, and no one can question that. Figures are speaking for themselves, not just for Africa, I mean for the West as well. So I think we need, dictators are everywhere. I do not think we are going around the world trying to copy governance systems of other countries. As we do in BRICS, we have different ideologies, we have different governing systems, different religions, and with so much differences. But I think we have common minimalist standard where we all agree. We want the reform of the system. We want to do more trade. We need to uplift people from poverty. We need to do fair trade. We also need to ensure that we build infrastructure and the like. So I think we agree on those and have modalities and understanding that we need to strengthen multilateral institutions as arena of resolving global conflicts. When I say Asia is the most important, it is in that context that whether dictators or not dictators, we need to ensure that they consume our products. And at the end of the day, that's what diplomacy is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Munyai, and thank you so much as well to our colleagues at the library. Sanusha, do you have even 15 seconds to add to what has been said before we close?
Okay, I just want to add to
Dr. Mondi is in.
Yeah.
I see his name popping. If you could invite him, if you can, he can sum up. I mean, I think he had a crisis. I mean, he's able to just join now, but he could sum up and give us before, if you can, Chair. I'm just suggesting.
Yes, let's just hear from Sanusha to just add
thank
to
you.
probably what you said, Prof, and then yes.
Thank you so much,
you.
and welcome to Dr. Mondi. Quick point on what David said. You know, it's not just about the fact that it's about human rights in the context of, you know, dictators and Asia and whatever. I think it's also about the question of how people are feeling in terms of their development, where they are in their lives and their livelihoods. And this is something that is being picked up as well in the context of West Africa, in terms of how people are looking at the military regimes that have come into power in Mali, Niger, and of course Burkina Faso, because they're seeing these leaders as representing them in terms of what is the social contract, but also what is development and how it's going to improve their lives. So I think we've got to be careful as well, because that is key right now in terms of how people are feeling marginalized by those that use the ballot box to also impose their political will and not necessarily address the socio-economic issues in these countries.
All right. Thank you very much, Sanusha. And yes, Prof. Mondi was actually supposed to be with us, but he ran late. So, Prof. Mondi, if in under 5 minutes you can please give us just brief remarks, and then we'll round up. Over to you.
Let me just apologize to all the speakers and to everyone who's joined here. I just had a mini crisis, but my point was going to be different. So I've missed the privilege of participating with my colleagues that were speaking earlier. But the point really I wanted to raise basically relates to the breaking down of the global world trading system. I think many of us will remember that the beginning of this world trading system took place at Bretton Woods. And in that process, there was a huge difference of opinion between America and England specifically. Keynes led the delegation team from the United Kingdom, and South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia were represented there, as well as other countries across the world, including China for that matter. And really, the point, the argument that I want to pose here, which I'm sure has been reiterated, is that the existing global system is breaking down. All of us know that this global trading system depended on higher wages. So as we earn higher wages, we demand an Apple Watch, we demand a jet haul car from China because the wages have increased for many of us as workers. However, as the wages have increased, they were driven mainly by the change in the whole architecture of the economy, which financialized many of the areas that used to be productive or production areas. What China has done very, very well is that it's done the other way around. It's had a lower wage and therefore a higher productivity. So Chinese workers led to a huge boom in productivity. And that productivity led to reinvestment of all the profits that are accruing to various companies, including state-owned companies. If you look, on the other hand, in the West, we have really been victims of interest rates. So when interest rates are very, very low, there's been more money to us and therefore more to buy in this global system. So the argument I'm pushing is that in a system like that, where we all dependent on the financial system to do well, it's never going to work. We need more productivity or more production in the economy, which is not good because it means that we have to lower the wage rate and therefore improve productivity. So why am I saying that? Is that it's a debate that we're having in South Africa around the global labor market. However, Keynes and John Robinson at that meeting in Bretton Woods argued this point, that one of the things that we need to look at is to form a customs union. That through a customs union, which we've done very, very well in the SACU region, where we're making sure that the tariff is the same, that we're trying to maintain or at least control our surpluses, our trade surpluses and our deficit, but there's a common pool where we share across. So Keynes' argument and John Robinson was that if the trading system that was being discussed then in 1946 at Bretton Woods, if it had to form customs union where they grow as we go along to make sure that productivity or production goes very, very high, that trade surplus and deficit are contained, that systems will work. So my argument, just in conclusion, because I don't want to keep too many people here because I'm very, very late in the day, is that China could underpin, given that many of us are biggest trading partners in the African continent with China. We can start trying this model using the lessons that we've learned from SACU, whereby China anchors this, as South Africa has done within SACU, anchors this, and then as African countries, we start building, again, maintaining our trade deficit, our trade surpluses with China, and China collecting these revenues, which are distributed over time in the SACU model. That's the point I'm to argue. So you may argue that this is not a global system, but we start here, we make sure that it works, and over time we bring in more countries. That doesn't mean that China becomes our only trading partner. There could be other players that are not part of SACU, of the customs union. In this case, we know that in SACU, the other players that are necessarily not part of SACU, but we trade with them. But that allows us over time to control a crisis that we face whereby only one country benefits. We know in this system, the Americans have been the biggest beneficiary because by lowering interest rates, they were able to look good whilst indebting their own people, and hence the mess they're in. High levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, a mess for the majority of Americans due to these policy choices. That's the point I wanted to make, and apologies again that I was late. I didn't hear your voices. But Professor Munyai, don't deter. I'm very sorry that I'm late. I had a mini crisis. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Prof. Munyai, did you have something to say?
No. I think, yeah, we can, it's all covered.
All right, no problem. Once again, thanks, first of all, to everyone who made time. I see that people have really stuck to the program right up to the end. So thank you very much, everyone, from wherever you're reaching us for making time. Please keep your eye on the website of the Center for African-China Studies for future events that will be coming up later in the year. I would also like to thank our colleagues from the library. As usual, you have been a reliable partner in facilitating this particular event. So once again, Palisa, please convey our thanks to your colleagues. To our colleagues here as well at the center, Zizi, Po, and Koitsione, and our researchers, thanks once again for putting together the concept that brought this event together. To our presenters, our thanks are endless. And thank you very much, Sanusha. We will keep in close touch as usual because we really value your input to our center. And with Prof. Mondi, we hope to have an extensive collaboration with you as well in our future events. So from wherever you are reaching us, thank you very much, and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thank you.